Good afternoon, Ms. Young here. Today I wanted to take you through a problem that could just as easily be dealt with in many different computer science exam boards, but this is specifically for Cambridge AS level. And today I'm using this app for an IDE which is specifically designed for Cambridge International. And the question that I'm given today is that to write two methods, and I've been a little bit vague in that. The first method is count vowels, which accepts, let me spell that correctly, which accepts a parameter sentence and returns a number of each vowel. For example, hello apple will return, well, we've got one A, we've got two E's, and we've got one O, and no I's or U's. The second one is display vowel count, which accepts a single parameter sentence, calls the function count vowels, and I've called it a function here. It should really be method, and we'll see why that is in a minute. And then display the total words in that, and we can assume the sentence will be lowercase. And most of this is a straightforward exercise, but the reason I wanted to go through this was because there are some points that I think are important to understand about the AS specification. So for the moment, let's assume it's going to be a function, and we are going to say, first of all, I'm just going to write the count vowels. So count vowels, I'm just going to write that one first. And that takes a sentence we've seen, and that is a string. And then of course, if it's a function, it needs to return something, and we'll come back to that later on as well, because this is the point of this video. So what I tend to do is I like to leave some space and come back and do my declarations later when I know which ones I am needing to add. So we are going to count, and there are other ways of doing this, and so don't shout. I want to try and do this in the most basic way possible. So what we can do here is we can say total A, or it's a counting algorithm, so we'll say count A, and we're going to initialize that to 0, and we want A, E, I, O, and U. So we want to initialize the counters of A's, E's, I's, O, and U. Like I said, there are other ways to do this, but for the moment, this is not really the point of the exercise, although if you're in a jam in the exam and you get a question like this is perfectly legitimate way of answering the question. So we need to now go and loop from 1, 2, and we can get the length here of the sentence. And so now that we have that, what we can do is I like to cache the value. So we're going to go, the current letter is, then what we want to take is the mid of sentence, and that would be an I and 1, because we want to get each individual letter, and then we have that. So now we can say case of letter. I'm just going to stick with Cambridge Pascal case of letter, and what we want to do is we can say if it's an A, then we can say that the count A is equal to count A plus 1, and we can do that now for A, E, I, O, and U. A, E, I, O, and U, and obviously we need to now change that to E, I, O, and U, and once more here, E, I, A, E, I, A, E, I, whoops, can't work it out myself, A, E, I, O, and U. And we don't need to do anything in any other case, so that would be just fine. And then we can do next I, and that will quite happily give us a count of A, E, I, O and U. And then we need to, because it's a function, we need to return some value. And if we want to make sure we get that 1 mark in the exam for making sure that we have a correct method header, we need to add the end function as well. So the problem here that we have right now is that in reality I want to do return count A, count E and count I, count O and count U, and we could do that happily in something like Python, but we could not do that in Visual Basic, and we certainly couldn't do that in Java. In Python that would return it as a tuple of 5 ints. But the problem is here is that we can't return an integer because it returns 5 integers separated by a comma. So this would not work. So there are other ways again to do this. Okay, the reason why I'm going to leave out the declarations is it'll be hopefully obvious in a second. So what I'm going to do though is I'm going to set the procedure, and we're going to call that display vowel count, and again that takes a sentence, and that is a string, and it's a procedure, so we don't need to do anything. And we can then at some point in time we want to count vowels, and we need to send on the sentence. Now if that's a function we need to return a value. If it's a procedure then we don't. So we're in this NVIDIA situation where we can't call a function because we're trying to return 5 individual variables, which is not permissible. So how can we do that? Well, what we can do is, if we remember from the topic on pseudocode and passing by value and by reference, we know that we can in fact set up our declarations here. So we can declare count A, E, I, O and U. So I can declare my variables here, count A, E and I, O and U. And in fact what I can then do is I can then pass these to this function here, but instead of making it a function I'm going to make it a procedure. And why have I done that? Well, because count A, if we pass that one by reference, and that is integer, I'm just going to copy this, make my life a little bit easier. And so count E, I, O, and finally U, and because it is a procedure we know returns. And so what by passing it by reference means, obviously hopefully you'll be aware, is that normally this variable here, my apologies, this variable here is a different variable to this count A, because we're passing it by value. So it's not passing the memory address of count A, it's passing the value of count A. And in this particular case we want to say no, I want to pass the reference to count A, not the value of count A. So by doing this we instruct count vowels to say wherever you see count A, I actually want you to update my version of count A, not a local version. So now whenever we set these to be 0, these variables here will actually be set to 0. And so again I don't need to do a return here because this is a procedure. Just make sure that this is updated correctly. And so now what happens is this will update count A, E, I, O and U, and which will then of course, because it's being passed by reference, of course we need to pass those by reference now, and that now we can then do a simple, I'm just going to copy this just to save me some time. We can do outputs and we can say something like total A's, and then we can use an ampersand and we can write count A. Again, I'm just going to repeat that. So we can put an ampersand again, and just going to put a space in here this time. A's, E's, and I'm going to keep copying these now. E's, I's, O's, and U's. Moment, let me show I've got all those. A, E, I, here we go, and O, and U. And now this procedure, because it's passing by a reference, wherever we make changes to count A in here, that will automatically be reflected in this in the variables up here. So that would be one way of achieving this goal, by using pass by reference. So it's important that you remember how pass by reference works. So that's one way of dealing with it, but it's not the only way of dealing with it. And so what I'm going to do now is say, well, how could we in fact do it in a different way? And then what we could do is, instead of sending this data by ref, we could in fact return an array of 5 items of either a string or a char. And then what we can do here is we can, instead of saying count A is 0, what we can do is we can create something like vowel counts. Well, first of all, we'll declare vowel counts as an array 1 to 5 of char, and then we can do, I'm not suggesting this is the best way to do it, by the way, I'm just explaining different ways on which you can complete this particular task. The idea is to show how we can return multiple values back from a function. One way is to in fact not use a function and to pass by ref, which I just showed you. Whoops. And then this is this, but of course now instead of vowel A I have to change all of these to this. It's a bit messy, but it's okay. So that becomes vowel counts again at 1, and this becomes vowel counts at 1. I'll just do these for speed. So that becomes 2, and this one becomes 3. Oops. And so while I'm doing this, I think this is quite a nice IDE. Unfortunately, you can, whilst you can run it for very basic programs to check that it's working, if you have things like str to num or num to str, then unfortunately they are not within the syntax of the compiler on here, so it does not work properly, but that's okay. From my point of view, it lets me do a nice video like this. And now what we can do is I can return vowel counts, and then up here again I'm just going to go, I may as well, I'm just going to call this vowel array just to keep things slightly different, and then this time I'm going to say vowel array is equal to count, and of course we only need to send the sentence now. And then here, what are we going to do? We're going to say, what are we calling it? Vowel array at 1, and this one would be vowel array at 2, and this one will be vowel array at 3. This one will be vowel array at 4, and then finally vowel array at 5. So now what we're doing is returning a single object, an array of 5 chars, and it's a little bit messier, and of course, as I said before, there are other ways of doing this, which makes this this code a little less verbose, but that is not the point of this exercise. The point is now that we can return a simple array, which is one item, and so now this code will work just fine. The final way to do this is to use a record. Now we know that records are used to allow us to group together disparate data types, for example, which we can then use for an array, because an array must be of a single data type, and we can trick the array into believing we have a single data type by using a record, and that record in itself then contains different data types. But we can also use it to our advantage here. We can say type counts, and then we can declare a, and that is an integer, and e, and I, and o, and u. So a, e, I, o, and u, and don't forget to add your end type here. So what this allows us to do is now we can declare a variable of type counts. Let's call it vowel count, so it's a little bit more obvious what we're trying to do. And now, instead of a vowel array, we have a vowel count, which is of type vowel count, and we can get the vowel count back from here, and this is exactly the same. How does this change now? Well, we have to say that vowel count dot a is that. Now it doesn't save as a great, but using indices is fine in an array, but this kind of makes it, from my point of view, a lot easier to debug and to understand when you're going through the program, because you don't have to think what is it that 0 refers to, and so we can do it just like this. Nothing else changes here, but again we have vowel count dot a, vowel count dot a, e, and I, and O, and obviously it would have been a lot better if we'd have done this from the beginning. We wouldn't be repeating this, but the point is I'm trying to show you different ways that this could be achieved. Let's just make sure that all of these are correct, and we're not focusing upon the count vowel method so much as how we return a value back from it, where we have a number of different sub items, if you will. So now I can return vowel count, and I'm returning an record, so it's a single value rather than an array. And then of course, hopefully you can see what's going on here. You can see that I'm just going to change that to .a, and this shouldn't be this should be vowel count, of course. I'm just going to quickly change these, and so vowel count .a, e, I, o, and finally u. And so by passing this as a record of type vowel counts, and of course in Cambridge they often use T to recognize it as a type, so it's easy to stand out. And whilst I'm not convinced, just to make it more consistent with Cambridge, I will put the T on here. And so that is another way of dealing with this particular problem. So what we have now is we have a procedure called display, where we take the sentence and we, if I could spell declare properly, and then essentially I seem to have a real issue spelling the word declare. So now we have used a record. So in order to do this, I've shown you that we can change a function into a procedure and send variables across by reference. And obviously when we do that, we don't need a return because it's a procedure. It makes it quite simple, but we have to then pass all of those by reference here and add them all in the procedure definition. And of course this doesn't return an array of 1 to 5 anymore, it returns a T vowel counts. And sorry, just to make sure these are correct, these are T vowel counts. So that is 3 different ways of how you can return multiple pieces of data back from a function by either not being a function and using a pass by reference. Of course, you could have a function which passes some values by reference and then physically returns a value as well. But in this case, we could make it a procedure. Then we use an array to hold that data with, and of course in this particular case A, E, I, O and U are 0, 1, 2, 3 or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Not too difficult to follow, but in my opinion, if you're not going to use by ref, then using a record like this makes this far easier to for me to write and to debug. So that is the end of this. If you would like, I will do how to make this a simpler algorithm. But for now, I'm Miss Young, and thank you for watching. I'll see you later.